Hello all, and now we're going to introduce Immanuel Kant into the fold on the channel. And I guess this video is just going to be really highlighting what his project is, what he wanted to seek to do in his first critique, and then we might get into some of the terminology and maybe start on the critique of pure reason itself. But this is going to be largely introductory, so if you're not interested in that, then stay tuned for the next one. But as we start here, leaving the Realists behind, or the Scottish ones, with Thomas Reid, we look to see where Kant's coming from, in that he obviously thought highly of David Hume and his skepticism that he brought on metaphysical suppositions. And of course, Kant famously points out that Hume woke him up from his dogmatic slumber of Leibniz and the kind of inherited tradition that he has from Descartes, and that was passed down to him. And so when we look at what he differs as opposed to the realists, of course, is he thinks Thomas Reid missed the point completely, that Hume wasn't asking whether causality was ethical or if it was necessary. He was asking whether or not reason alone could be accessed a priori from experience. That's what Kant is trying to focus on. Kant's not really impressed with the idea that, although he thinks highly, of course, of the ethics of common sense, and you can see that sort of parallel there, but simply because it's a gift from God doesn't mean that it's something that you can just appeal towards without actually seeing it in action, without actually seeing the gust of it, if you will. And so Kant is going to point out 12 different positions or points of contention, really, on understanding where you can have this sort of a priori metaphysical example, this sort of a synthetic a priori proposition, as it were. And so I suppose that really would highlight some of the terminology here, with the idea that the dogmatic philosophers, of course, are these metaphysicians that came prior, such as Leibniz, such as Spinoza, of course. The skeptical clearly would be someone like Hume, and he wants to introduce, of course, the concept of the critical philosophy. He wants to, of course, start the next epoch of finding what the basis of understanding actually is to begin with. What are the credentials, the conditions, and the foundations that make metaphysical propositions possible to begin with? Of course, is what critical philosophy is seeking to do, whether or not you actually think Kant pulls it off. And so really what he's trying to say is that the preconditions are what make the possibility of understanding moral, metaphysical, and aesthetic knowledge. These this is kind of the ingredients, if you will, for his metaphysical beliefs. If you take a bit of all three and put them together, as he does in the critiques, you can find his sort of metaphysical belief system in relation, of course, to the sciences. And so if you really want a rough summation, this sort of raw bones and the meat of it, I suppose, it would be that the critique of pure reason really is about only having the kind of knowledge of phenomenon, only having the knowledge of appearances being possible. But, as he points out in the practical theory, we are constrained to believe, of course. he kind of has one of my favorite quotes, actually, as kind of an aside here. We'll have to do away with knowledge to make room for belief. I always thought that that was a really Kantian line, and I have a great deal of respect for it. Kant is one of my favorites, and I think Critique of Pure Reason is a very moving work, actually, in my own assessment. But getting behind my own biases here, of course, I wanted to talk about the logical truths that he wants to build, of course, out of the axiom that mathematics can, offer this sort of synthetic a priori. But before getting too far ahead, of course, we have to go over some of these terminologies in a more technical sense if we want to grasp the text for what Kant's really trying to do. You can also point to that hand down of the Platonic distinction, of course, between knowledge and belief. But of course, that's going to start to dissipate from here. It's kind of an interesting aside to talk about when it comes to logical truths. What are the circumstances for belief as a sort of substratum of knowledge? This is definitely different from the way knowledge and belief was seen in prior thinkers. Of course, this isn't necessarily just relegated to Kant, but it's more in his legacy, of course. And so to Kant, of course, as we were saying, analytical truths, if you were to see it as what the predicated subject is, of course, embedded within its axiom of the subject itself. You can't separate what's predicated off of it, as opposed to the synthetic truth, the subject matter. This kind of adds to the subject, but of course it's not predicated on it. This is kind of the more subjective, if you will, example of all single men are bachelors, but are they all miserable? That is kind of more of a synthetic example. But moving on to the a posterior is a bit easier to handle as opposed to the a priori, and the a posterior, of course, is dependent on after experiencing phenomena. That's sort of post-reflection, if you will, in that Lockean sense. And of course, the analytics are independent of experience, whereas with an example of the synthetic a priori is the universal necessity of the a priori truths, that they're all universal, that they can all start with these suppositions, of course, prior to experience. It is somewhat of an example of pouring experience into some kind of dense object that complements it, a sort of molding, if you will. It's like the wax pouring into a mold that complements its shape. We have these sort of forms, these sort of cognitions that are prior to experience, of course. And so I suppose to really look at when we talk about his sort of transcendental, aesthetic, analytic, and dialectic, it's kind of along the lines of math, physics, and metaphysics. And of course, when he talks about famously about transcendental knowledge, these sort of a priori concepts, what do they have to offer in the sense of the resources of what the human mind can actually do with these a priori concepts? And of course, this is going to lead in later with romantic notions that obviously had a lot of impact in America. Transcendental, of course, has a far different meaning before you get to Kant, probably, because of the background of American and the sort of pantheistic tradition that we've adopted or have a sort of how would you say, a sort of redheaded stepchild, if you will, of it. This goes back here with Kant, because he wants to look at these sort of inner resources of what the human mind has to offer us. And this gets appropriated with spirit, obviously, when it comes to the German Romanticists as well, and the American variation of it. And I think that's kind of important to look at, because many times philosophers and theorists, they don't really know what is going to come about their theories in relation to how everyone else is going to take them in. Of course, famously here, as we've pointed out, Thomas Reid doesn't apparently understand Hume in the way that Kant does. Kant's way more thorough and understands the questions than Hume is trying to ask skeptically. And so really one must ask sometimes, not only does the theorist get it right, but the interpretation of the theorist also plays a role. And I think that really, if there's a thinker other than perhaps maybe Hume here, I would think of Nietzsche for sure in that context. But anyway, that's for a different day. But and so, of course, when it comes to what he has to say about the transcendental method, as it were, this is, of course, the attempt to try to tap into those resources of what the human mind can offer us. As we pointed out, the sort of ending of the kind of epoch of the rational way of looking at these sort of things, as opposed to the rise of the spirit and cognition, is a really interesting way to kind of see the transition here, as it were. But Kant here wants to really critique this sort of traditional way of how we went about knowledge and epistemology. He wants to, find what these kind of universal presuppositions could be. What is our framework? What is that sort of example of the mold? What is that made of? How does that actually work? And that's what makes Kant so interesting. It's kind of a way to look at your own personal life. You kind of have these stories or these kind of ideas that are drawn in you, that it's like you have a sort of lens of perspective of the way you were going to see the world, or these sort of different personality types. That's always a popular thing going around in the culture right now, the kind of Myers-Briggs analysis and things like that. We want to understand the sort of framework, the sort of lens that makes the kind of theater of appearances, as it were, to Hume, as he mentioned as well. And so really Kant, the be-all end-all, is the kind of objectivity of all perception. But of course this kind of, well, it doesn't kind of, it falls apart in the end, of course, with the way perception and the way of framing that Kant offered us aged just in the span of a couple decades here, as people to come after, of course, were quick to point out that these are the cultural signifiers towards an a priori experience. And this is, of course, relativized, and of course one of the fallouts out of that is that knowledge itself is therefore relativized. If we have these signifiers that frame the way reality can be perceived for us, then it becomes a kind of relative way of looking at things. And I think that's important to grasp your mind around before delving deeper into philosophy after Kant. for sure. And really, of course, there's the footnotes to Plato and even the variation of footnotes to Hegel. But really, of course, in the modern West, everything is in relation to after the critiques that Kant offers us here. So it's important to understand his terminology and his project before you maybe want to delve into one of the most enriching texts, I think, that philosophy in the West has to offer. So yeah, this is just a kind of glossary video, I suppose, that I wanted to do before we actually look at the Critique of Pure Reason itself. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys for the next one.